Okay, now let me tell you something about a very relevant conflict. The Six-Day War is a war that changed the geopolitics of the Middle East for decades, and consequences of this war are even felt today. So, how did the Israeli state manage to turn the tide of war in their favor in 1967? So, what happened essentially in 1967? Israel and Syria were engaged in border skirmishes, and Egypt, at least if you ask the Egyptians and Nasser, claimed that they just wanted to send a message to Israel not to go to war with Syria, which is why Egypt began to mobilize their forces. But Jews saw this as a threat, and they realized that they had to do a preemptive strike if they want to win the war. Because if you just looked at the data, the Israeli forces were in a very tricky position. While they had 100,000 men, the Arab coalition consisted of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan had 240,000 troops. Israel had 800 tanks, while the Arab coalition had 2,500 tanks. Israel had 300 planes, while the coalition had 1,000 planes. And so the Israelis decided to launch Operation Focus. And what's interesting is how brilliantly this operation was actually executed. And the Israeli forces were in quite a tricky position because Egypt had just gotten new Soviet aircrafts from Brezhnev, and the Jews, they didn't have technological advantage in this war as they had in the previous war. The Egyptians actually for the first time had some of the best aircrafts in the world because the Soviets sent them. And that is how the Israelis concluded they had to destroy the Egyptian Air Force in a preemptive strike, and they actually managed to destroy 80% of the Egyptian Air Force in one day, which is why the war lasted for 6 days. So 5th of June 1967, Israel launched Operation Focus. And by the way, Israel lost only 19 planes, while Egypt lost more than 250. But what was the brilliance of the operation? So, first of all the Israeli pilots got orders to fly below radars, and instead of attacking from the east, which is the fastest route, they went to fly above the sea and then attacked from the north, which is something that Egyptians weren't expecting. But the brilliance of the operation was, and as far as I know, this was actually a coincidence. So at 7:35 in the morning, the Egyptian morning patrol was over, and in the moment of the Jewish attack, the Egyptians only had 3 aircrafts in flight by pure accident, because at 7:35 the morning patrol came down and Egyptians had no planes in the air. And at 7:40 all the Egyptian pilots had breakfast, and Israel attacked precisely at 7:45 in the morning. But the brilliance of the operation was that Israeli forces decided not only to destroy the Egyptian aircrafts, but to destroy the ground on the airfields, because the Egyptian planes, they couldn't take off if the surface of the airfield wasn't flat, which is why Israelis used a specific type of bomb that would penetrate the earth and in some cases explode later. And when Nasser gave the order to fill the holes with cement, well, what began to happen is that as the workers would approach the holes, some bombs would explode later and kill the workers, which is why Egyptians became scared of approaching the holes and filling them with cement, which is how the Israelis managed to prevent the Egyptians in fixing their own airfields. And also the brilliance of the attack was the second wave of attack. So Egyptians, since they were expecting the Israeli attack, They didn't know it was going to happen that morning, but since they were expecting it generally, they made a bunch of fake planes and put it on the airfield in order for Israel to waste their rockets and bombs on fake airplanes. But in their second wave of attack, Israel decided to use their new weapon they had just bought from the French, the heat-guided missiles. And just as the Egyptian soldiers were beginning to react and enter their planes in order to engage the Israelis in combat, the second wave of attack happened and Israelis began to fire their heat-guided missiles and destroy only the planes that were actually real planes, since fake planes produced no heat. That was the brilliance of the second wave of attack, to use heat-guided missiles, because the Israelis actually knew that there were going to be fake planes on the ground. And after destroying 80% of the Egyptian Air Force in one day, the morale of the Egyptian soldiers was so low that their marshal decided to retreat from the battlefield, although they actually weren't doing that bad on the ground. And as they were retreating, the Israelis managed to ambush them and massacre 10,000 Egyptian soldiers in one day. And after the largest country of the Arab coalition was defeated, Syria and Jordan also asked for peace. And now some historians claim that Syria and Jordan were actually doing pretty good and that they could have continued, but they asked for peace because their political leadership was frightened by the early success that Israelis had against the Egyptians. And what happened after this war is a decision that is still relevant today. In their euphoria and in their triumph of quick victory, Israelis, they got too arrogant, and they felt like the Arabs could simply do nothing against them if they were able to win in a war so quickly, which is why they decided to start to build illegal settlements on the West Bank. In that year, the Israeli official policy became to build illegal settlements on the West Bank because the territory came under their control after the Six-Day War, and unfortunately the consequences of that decision are still felt today. If you watched the recent news, these attacks that are happening right now are in a way a direct consequence of that decision that was done in 1967.